Hey everyone. As one might expect, I've basically been continuing to play Baldur's Gate 3 virtually non-stop since it came out. I'm currently approaching the end of Act 2 as of the time of this recording, but I'm not quite ready to make a video summarizing my thoughts on that, as well as playing a Dark Urge up to that point, just yet, so I thought that in the meantime, I would talk about how I think Baldur's Gate 3 has really mechanically improved upon the systems present in D&D 5th edition, since I have a bit of a history of talking about my criticisms for that game, but also just how Baldur's Gate 3 has improved upon a ton of RPG tropes in general, even compared to Larian's past game, Divinity Original Sin 2. And if you're curious about what my exact criticisms are about games like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, then I highly recommend you check out the video that I'm going to link in the cards in the description down below, where I talk about things like why the martial and caster disparity is so great in 5th edition, and the kinds of problems that I think need to be addressed in future updates to the game and any other game that wants to be anything like D&D. And speaking of martials, for that matter, we might as well get into my first point about why I think Baldur's Gate 3 has improved upon the systems in D&D 5th edition, and that is that they've made martial combat so much more fun and interesting in this game. Basically, what they've done is they've given abilities to weapons, even if they're completely non-magical, so that martial characters, or really anybody that uses any kind of weapon, can use these powers to kind of mix up their attacks beyond just running up and hitting people to do a bunch of damage. And every single weapon seems to have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 different unique abilities that all refresh on a short rest that really allow you to strategize and synergize with these abilities for different situations. And some of these abilities are really fun and interesting, like there's a cleave that lets you hit multiple people with a single attack, and if you have multiple attacks, then that can really help you pile on the damage. There's also a charge move that lets you rush forward, but without actually consuming any of your movement, so it actually gives you a ton more mobility, and it's really useful in the pole arms that have additional reach on top of that. There's even some weapons, like Morning Stars and whatnot, that have the tenacity ability, which is more of a passive, but the practical upshot is that when you miss, you can still deal damage equal to your strength score to the target, so that you still get something out of it even if you didn't hit them, which can be really useful if you're playing a character that either has a low attack bonus, or if you're just going up against somebody who has a really high AC. It's such a straightforward and simple change to combat, but at the same time, it gives martials just so much more to work with so that they can actually strategize and plan their course of attack. Not to mention that it also makes your choice of weapon that much more interesting. Do I want to go for the halberd that has the wide reach and the ability to cleave a bunch of enemies in a row, or maybe I should go for the sword that gets the bonus action pommel strike so that I can get a little bit more damage in, or there's just so many interesting choices to be made. Not to mention dual wielding even has some interesting options, and some abilities can still be used when the weapon is in the offhand, which really adds even more synergies to the possibilities of what kinds of weapons you want to equip. Now, to be fair, this system is actually not too dissimilar from a system that they're currently playtesting for 5.5, where they're going to be adding abilities to weapons called weapon masteries, and instead of it being short rest abilities, they're actually sort of passive abilities that you can always use with every attack. But there are a few criticisms that I've had about that system, namely that you only have a single ability on each weapon, so if you want to mix things up within a single turn, you have to constantly be swapping weapons around all over the place, and that just gets kind of awkward and fumbly, and I think that the way Baldur's Gate 3 handles it, by giving each weapon multiple different abilities, is a much more fun and interesting variation on that system. Though, I will admit that because the abilities refresh on a short rest, that means of course you can only use them once in each combat, and then for the rest of your attacks, you're just relegated to trying to deal as much damage as possible, like normal. So, I might make another video in the future talking more in depth about this mechanic, because I think there could be something there if we maybe try to combine some of the ideas from Baldur's Gate 3's weapon system with the weapon mastery system that they're testing for D&D 5.5, and maybe we can get something that's even better than both of the sum of its parts. And if you want to see me make that video, then make sure to let me know down in the comments below, and give me a subscribe so that you'll be notified of when that video comes out in the future. Anyways, moving on to my next point, they've also greatly improved the main stat you use with a lot of martial weapons, namely strength. They've actually made strength a useful stat in Baldur's Gate 3. I know, if you're familiar with 5e, strength is the most dumpable stat that has ever existed in virtually any edition of Dungeons & Dragons. There's so many problems with it. I went into this in more detail in my Martial v Caster video, but to kind of give you a quick summary, some of the problems are that, you know, strength-based weapons just don't deal that much more damage than dexterity-based weapons, so it doesn't give you a ton of benefits. Strength-based armor doesn't give you that much more AC than just having a high dexterity, and in general, dexterity is just a better stat. And of course, on top of that, encumbrance is just basically a non-issue in 5th edition because of how high your base encumbrance is, even if you have below average strength. And they've really addressed a lot of these issues in Baldur's Gate 3 and just made strength a so much more interesting stat to actually utilize in combat. For one, they've actually reduced how much carrying capacity you get per point of your strength score, which sounds like a nerf, but it's actually a buff in that it makes your carrying capacity, and in turn your strength, more important. In base 5th edition, your carrying capacity is something like 15 times your strength score, which means that even when you have only 8 strength, you can still have over 100 pounds of equipment on you, no problem. In Baldur's Gate 3, it's still pretty high compared to past editions, but because it's only 10 times your strength score now, and you still have to take into account all your armor and every other random extraneous item that you're carrying, it actually makes your strength matter that much more when you're being a loot goblin trying to carry everything out of a cave. On top of that, they've changed 2 actions that you can do in 5e, but they've sort of reworked them into bonus actions that are much more heavily based on your strength score, and that is the ability to jump and shove opponents. So jumping in 5th edition is pretty straightforward. It is a strength check, and that does determine how far you can jump, but it still costs an equal amount of movement to jump that distance. So even if you roll absurdly well and you could jump like 40 feet for whatever reason, the problem is that because your movement is only, say, 30 feet, then you cannot jump further than you actually move, and so your jumping, it can't actually increase your move speed in any meaningful way. But in Baldur's Gate 3, jumping costs a fixed amount of move speed, which I believe is 10 feet or 3 meters. And as a result of this, that means that when you have a really high strength score, so say for example, when you have 20 strength, you can jump 35 feet for the cost of 10 feet, meaning that you gain effectively 25 feet of movement if you're willing to spend your bonus action just by being a high strength-based character. So essentially, just by virtue of having a good strength score, you almost get the effects of a level 2 rogue's cunning action dash, where they can dash as a bonus action, just by being super strong, and that alone gives strength a huge amount of value in the game. Like, suddenly barbarians are able to jump across cliffs and massive chasms to chase down enemies without needing to break out a ranged weapon, and, you know, in general, if an enemy is too far away, you can usually jump to help close the distance. But of course, that's not the only bonus action that you can do, because you can also shove creatures. And in base D&D, all you can do is shove people 5 feet, which is pretty laughable, and it doesn't cost a bonus action, it costs an attack in that game. But only being able to shove people 5 feet while giving up your damage for the round is kind of a poor trade-off, whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, it's a bonus action, so you don't have to give up any of your attacks, though you can only do it once per round by default. But because it's based on your strength score, it determines how far you can push enemies. You could shove people really far in Baldur's Gate 3 and really get some serious battlefield control. If somebody's harassing your squishy wizard, you're able to run up and shove them and then plant yourself between the wizard and the enemy to make sure that they can't get back to them. And of course, if anybody's standing near a cliff, fall damage is very much a thing in Baldur's Gate 3, and strength characters have the best capabilities to take advantage of that. But yeah, overall, strength is just so much better in Baldur's Gate 3 compared to D&D. Like, I'll admit, shamelessly, that I have played lots of characters in Dungeons & Dragons that just have 8 strength because it just doesn't matter. Even if I'm playing a frontliner, I'll usually just go for a dex build instead and dump my strength out the window. But in Baldur's Gate 3, including myself, my party consists of 3 people that have a strength score of 18 or higher. Like, I'm running with the beef squad because I love how useful strength is. And we're able to run around jumping all over the place, shoving enemies off cliffs. Like, it's such a great time. Anyways, moving on to my next point. Another big thing that they've improved upon in 5th edition is that they have kind of rebalanced a lot of the classes. Like, a ton of the classes are just made better with how they're implemented in Baldur's Gate 3, especially the classes that needed it the most, like the Monk and the Ranger. Now, I won't go into too much detail about this because I'm only doing a single playthrough right now where I'm only playing as a handful of the classes, so I don't have all the experience in playing as every class, but just browsing the wiki and looking what other people have been saying who've been playing different classes, they've really done a lot of good changes for the better. So, just as a single example, let's take a look at the Monk. The Monk has always been kind of a problematic class, not just in 5th edition, but really in most versions of D&D for any number of reasons. For one, resource expenditure tends to be a bit finicky with how ki usually works, and they also tend to rely on a lot of different stats at the same time. A good monk is going to obviously want high wisdom, because that's what their ki abilities are based off of, but they also want high dexterity for good armor class, as well as being able to use it to hit things, and they're also going to want good constitution so that they can survive being on the front line. And of course, you could also play a strength-based monk, which is much more viable in this game, but of course that means you're sacrificing AC, and also if you're the main character, then you're going to want charisma, and you could just see how it gets a bit out of hand. So monks kind of needed a little bit of a boost in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's exactly what they did. So, for example, one of the first changes they made is that monks get an extra ki point at first level, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is, because monks really struggle at early levels to manage their ki. Like, when you're level 3 and you only have 3 ki points, like, you burn through those so quickly in just a single combat, and even when you get them back in a short rest, it's really disheartening when you burn through all your ki, and now you're basically just a guy that punches people with no special effects tied to it. And it's just really hard to work around. So just getting that one extra ki point early on really helps them last just a little bit longer in combat. But then on top of that, when you get your subclasses, 2 of the subclasses actually get abilities that let them restore their ki before they have to even take a short rest. And I believe those 2 subclasses are 2 of the more ki-hungry ones, especially Way of the Four Elements, which the way it works in 5e is you basically spend ki points in place of spending spell slots, but as a result you start burning through your ki really, really quickly until you eventually get to high levels when you have a ton of ki. But in this, they've given you ways to restore your ki without needing to spend a short rest, and I believe a lot of the abilities actually cost less ki than normal. And on top of that, there's some cool new features that these new subclasses get that is really fun and interesting, and I love how it also interacts with some of the systems I talked about previously, like how strength is more useful. And on top of that, there's just a lot more classes that, like, to speak more generally again, a lot of classes have very useful bonus actions now. Like I said, the buffs to strength mean that barbarians actually have things to do with their bonus action, which in base D&D wasn't really much of the case. Like, they would use their bonus action to enter rage, and there wasn't much else to do with it outside of a couple subclasses. Whereas now, basically any strength-based class has useful things that they can use their bonus action for. And, in general, just so many classes have so many more fun tools and abilities to work with. Like even my first point with martial combat, that alone makes fighters more interesting even if you're not playing with the Battle Master. But anyways, I don't need to go on a 2-hour-long tangent talking about every single little improvement they've made to every single class and subclass in the game. So, moving on to my next point, which is actually that they've made short rests basically instantaneous, which that in and of itself actually buffs a lot of the classes that really needed it. Short rests have always been kind of an awkward prospect in 5th edition. An hour doesn't seem like a long time to do a rest, but when you have any degree of urgency in the plot, stopping to eat lunch for an hour after a fight really feels like it takes way too long. And one big suggestion that gets brought up a lot to improve the game and to help buff classes like fighters and warlocks and whatnot that could really use the buff is that just make short rests shorter, like 5 or 10 minutes long, so that it's a much more reasonable time frame to spend catching your breath after a fight, even if you're in a more urgent situation. And to that effect, Baldur's Gate 3 essentially makes short rests instant. For example, without getting too much into spoilers, there was a part of the game where I was getting into essentially a raid, and I had to take care of a lot of the lower level troops at the ground floor before moving on to the boss at the top. And if this was a normal game of D&D, I would fight through the horde of enemies at the bottom, and then sitting for an hour before challenging the boss would be way out of the question in that kind of scenario. Like, what is he supposed to do? Just sit at the top of the tower on his ass, just picking his nose for an hour while we eat lunch? Like, that's not... no DM would be behind that idea. But in Baldur's Gate 3, I was able to rest between those two fights, which made it so that my short rest classes, like my Battlemaster Fighter, were able to go all out in both fights at full effectiveness. And I think that that was a massive improvement for the game. Now, to be fair, they do also kind of nerf short rests a little bit by making it so that you can only short rest twice per day, but I feel like that's mostly just because they didn't want to bother using hit dice as a resource, and so as a result, it was just the easiest thing to do, especially since the game does kind of encourage you to long rest more often in order to activate certain story beats. But I feel like we could take this idea of a much shorter short rest and apply it to 5th edition, but just keep the hit dice resource to prevent people from using it for infinite healing, and you'd be able to short rest so much more effectively, and it would buff so many classes that really need the help. And finally, this last point that I want to make is less of an issue that I think Baldur's Gate 3 improves upon over D&D specifically, and more of a criticism towards a lot of RPGs in general, including Larian's last big giant RPG, Divinity Original Sin 2. And the main thing is that in Baldur's Gate 3, equipment doesn't get stale as you level. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, take Divinity Original Sin 2 just as an example. Early on in that game, in Act 1, you can find an armor set that is meant to be representative of this character. I think his name is like Bacchus Rex or something like that. He's basically Super Hitler or something like that, and you can find his full armor set, and it's meant to be this like ancient, legendary, mythical armor. But the problem is that it's scaled for when you're meant to find it in the game, which is around like level 4 or 5 or so, I think. And so, it's great armor for a level 5 character, but because everything in that game is so numerically based, and as a result, it's all about trying to get the biggest numbers, as you go on, you're inevitably going to find armors that have higher and higher stats until eventually you get to the absurdity where near the end game, when you're like approaching level 20, you're going to be finding basic armor that has like 10 times higher stats than this supposed ancient mythical legendary suit of armor that you found early on in the game, because that's just how the scaling of the items has to be in that game. It's not exactly the worst thing in the world, but it can cause some serious, if you forgive me for using the term, ludonarrative dissonance when you find this really cool set of armor, and then it just is somehow useless because you got stronger, and thus you can't use the armor as effectively because it's not scaled for your new level, and it just doesn't make a ton of sense. And D&D in general actually improves upon this pretty well on its own, just by virtue of the fact that numbers aren't as important in 5th edition. The highest enchantment a weapon can have is only a +3 bonus, and your stats are generally capped at 20 until you get to like epic levels, and this is carried forward into Baldur's Gate 3, and then where Baldur's Gate 3 improves upon D&D is by creating a much wider variety of much more interesting magic items that grant you bonus spells or even just random passive effects that admittedly might be harder and more annoying to manage on a physical tabletop, but that is the strength of a digital medium. To give you guys an example, early on in Act 1, I don't remember exactly where I found it, but I found a ring that essentially will passively cast Bless on anybody that I heal, and it has no use limit, and it'll trigger anytime I heal anyone. So for example, if I cast Cure Wounds, or Mass Cure Wounds rather, or Mass Healing Word, some kind of big AoE heal, it'll apply Bless for free without needing concentration to anybody that I heal, including people that aren't even in my party if I'm fighting alongside allies. And keep in mind that I'm playing as a Oath of the Ancients Paladin, which early on gets a free, once per short rest, AoE heal that they can use as a bonus action. And so, as a result, that ring has been glued to my finger ever since I found it at the beginning of Act 1, and I'm probably going to beat the game with it unless I find a ring that basically does the same thing but better. And, like, that's just a basic uncommon magic item that I found early on that I'm still gonna use throughout the end of the game. And that's not the only one either. I also found a Headband of Intellect, which, thanks to the fact that I'm running with Beef Squad, where everybody has over 18 strength, a downside is that almost everybody in my party is also a moron, so I've been using that Headband of Intellect to kind of help make up for that fact and at least give one person in my party the brain cell for the evening. And on top of that, I also found a suit of magic armor that I got in Act 1. And to be fair, it was closer towards the end of Act 1, but I highly doubt I'm going to find a better suit of armor that I'm going to want to swap it out for by the end of the game, especially given that I've now beaten Act 2, and I'm still rocking this armor, and it's way better than almost anything else I've found so far. Not to mention the fact that there's a lot more synergies between magic items, where there are various effects that definitely compound upon each other. I mean, just to use my ring that I mentioned earlier as an example again, I also found a necklace that lets me cast Healing Word and Mass Healing Word for free once a day each, and as you might guess, that of course synergizes with my ring that passively casts Bless on people that I heal. I mean, the Mass Healing Word has a way wider range than my Paladin heal, so even though it's usable only once a day, it's really useful if my party has to be spread out. I can still bless everyone for free with it. And there's lots of other items like that. Like, there's a whole set of, like, thunder-based equipment that I've never seen before in any D&D book that I've read. But I imagine if you actually gather all of these, like, thunder charge-based equipment and then put them all in one character, you might actually be able to get something pretty interesting out of it. And this is further enhanced by the fact that they've essentially gotten rid of the attunement system from 5th edition. Now, I don't think the attunement system is necessarily a bad system in 5th edition, but it is fairly limited in that you can only attune to 3 items at a time, and then everything else has to be essentially non-attunement magic items. Whereas this game sort of returns to a more classic style of magic item like they did in 3.5, where it was based on slots. So like you have a boot slot, you have a helmet slot, that kind of thing, and as a result, it's more, which just generally makes more sense for a video game in my opinion. But as a result, you can carry a lot more magic items on your person at a time, since you have like 5 or 6, I think, different slots for different magic items, which gives you a lot of room to create multiple different synergies within your build, especially with how interesting all of the magic items are in this game. Anyways, I think that I could probably continue to sing this game's praises for hours and hours, so I should probably try to wrap things up in some kind of a conclusion. At the end of the day, Baldur's Gate 3 improves upon not just so many ideas from D&D 5th edition, but really just RPGs in general. Like, mechanically, this game is so satisfying to play, both in terms of combat as well as the freedom of choice you have and how you approach a situation and the kinds of things that you could do once you're in a sticky situation, and just the ways that you could try to get out, both by talking and role-playing or fighting or anything. And it's so fun, and I love how they've adapted the game into this format and the way that they've taken advantage of the digital medium. But yeah, anyways, as always, I'm eager to continue the conversation down in the comments below, so let me know what your thoughts are on Baldur's Gate 3 and the kinds of improvements or changes that they've made to other systems. Like, do you like all the changes that I've been talking about compared to 5th edition? Or maybe do you have some criticisms about things that maybe they shouldn't change? I know that there's a few bugs that definitely have been hindering some people's experiences. Like, I believe the Arcane Trickster is bugged for a lot of people, though I personally wasn't able to replicate it. But anyways, feel free to let me know down in the comments what your thoughts on the matter are. And if you like this video, then feel free to give me a like, and if you want to see me make more videos like this, make sure to give me a subscribe so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. And with that, I think I'll see you guys next time.